will be on their way. We must complete the Neuralink immediately. Please install the final battery.
When I first played Titanfall 2, I was hit with an unexpected wave of nostalgia. Not for Titanfall 1 or really any game in particular, but rather an era of gaming that has come to pass. Titanfall 2 resonates so much to me personally because it's a game that reminded me of what it felt like to fall in love with games for the first time. When games were created with passion, invention, and innovation, when the single-player experience was worth playing, when games felt complete at launch and the post-launch content was worth the price, a time when I paid $60 for an experience that was priceless. It's rare that a AAA game is released without a certain amount of controversy or uproar about one of its features. Between loot boxes, season passes, and unfinished releases, we've become so accustomed to bad business practices that not including them has become an innovation in and of itself. Almost every AAA release has something in it that leaves a bad taste in your mouth, which is why fans of Titanfall 2 are so passionate about the franchise. Of all the multiplayer games that I've ever played, Titanfall 2 has the least amount of toxicity and negativity surrounding it. The people who play Titanfall love Titanfall. And aside from its excellent core gameplay, this is probably the biggest reason why I keep coming back time and time again. The Titanfall franchise is something that's actually worth talking about, which is why I'm making these videos. This video is the first in a 13-episode series where I'll explain what I would like to see in future Titanfall games. Each video will have a particular topic which I'll discuss in detail. These topics can range anywhere from pilot and Titan gameplay to game modes and single player, and I think that I covered every major aspect of the Titanfall experience in this series. This video is an introduction to the series where I'll discuss Titanfall's strengths and weaknesses, as well as explaining what you can expect from these videos. So without further ado, let's get into it. To start off, I want to explain what I think are Titanfall's strengths as a franchise. First and foremost, Titanfall is about momentum. Note that I said momentum and not speed. I think the movement system is the most obvious momentum-based mechanic and the one players instantly recognize. But in my opinion, it isn't even the most important momentum-based mechanic, and I would argue that the yellow bonus bar on your Titan build meter is instead. We've all noticed this little yellow bar, but I'm not sure how many people understand how important it is to the metagame of Titanfall 2. The bonus bar is the difference between getting spawn killed by a Ronin and getting first to fall. It's the difference between getting 2 Titans in a match versus 4. Once I realized this, my performance in-game skyrocketed. It's the reason why I use the backup battery boost exclusively to feed friendly Titans some batteries. Not only does it help my team, but when combined with the yellow bonus bar, you can use it to get your Titan back much faster. Using this strategy, I almost always have my Titan whenever I need it. But this is where the conflict with speed is most apparent. When you die, you lose your bonus bar, so if you're close to getting your next Titan, you may not want to play aggressively since you could easily lose that bonus. Playing fast may give you the most speed, but you could easily lose all of your momentum in a single death. I absolutely love this aspect of Titanfall since it adds a layer of strategy and critical thought in a game that's snappy and agile. It's a perfect blend of different thought processes that work very nicely together. It's Titanfall 2's peanut butter and jam. The next reason that I love Titanfall 2 so much is because of the variety that the game offers you. Campaign aside, this is probably the biggest difference between Titanfall 1 and Titanfall 2. Titanfall 1 is a great game that I thoroughly enjoy, but it doesn't have the staying power that Titanfall 2 does. This has led me to the conclusion that Titanfall 2's biggest innovation wasn't the inclusion of a single-player campaign, but rather the variety of unique Titan classes and tactical abilities. In Titanfall 1, I felt that most of the game boiled down to a single playstyle, which inevitably led to the player base decline. It wasn't long before most people were using a Stim and R101 loadout with a chain gun or 40mm Atlas Titan, since these were the most effective weapons at complementing the core playstyle. And as fun as that playstyle is, if you do something over and over again, it will eventually get a bit stale. This aspect of the game was improved drastically in Titanfall 2. While you could probably make the argument that grapple with the car SMG is the Stim R101 equivalent, I feel that Titanfall 2's expanded sandbox depth has opened the doors for players to come up with alternate, yet still very much viable loadouts. I for one routinely use all of my different loadouts, and in fact I wish that I had even more loadout slots to play around with. But even if you only use a grapple car loadout, there's no denying that Titan gameplay has become significantly more varied with the preset Titan loadouts. It's funny how removing customization actually added a lot more variety to the game, and the interplay between the various different Titans makes each match feel fresh and unique. With the preset Titan class system, there is no Titan that is the best in every situation, which really incentivizes players to use different Titans. The ability to change your playstyle at the press of a button has proven to be effective at retaining an audience. I would also attribute a part of Rainbow Six Siege and Overwatch's success to this factor as well, being able to use different heroes and operators that play in completely different ways game after game. This mechanic is one that I feel translated very well into Titanfall's formula, and is one of the reasons why I can continue to enjoy the experience over 700 hours later. The last aspect of Titanfall 2 that I'll mention is the casual-hardcore balance. This is based a lot more in preference than the other elements of the game, and I think that many different types of players will have a different perspective. Personally, I feel that Titanfall 2 has struck an excellent balance by being inviting, but not holding your hand, and I've always liked games that were easy to play but tough to master. Titanfall 2 can still be an enjoyable experience even if you aren't particularly good at it, but at the same time, the game has enough mechanical complexity to encourage you to improve. It's easy to enjoy, but it isn't easy to excel. Of course, Titanfall 2 could be better for casual or hardcore players, but I much prefer the middle-of-the-road route that Respawn went down. Like I said before, this is something that will be different for each individual player, and I'm sure highly competitive players and casual players will take issue with what I said. Titanfall 2 is neither casual nor competitive, and I love it for that reason. Now I know that a lot of players want the game to be skewed in one direction or the other, but I think it's important to ensure that neither side is negatively impacting the other any more than it already is. Some players may want a skill-based ranking system, but how will that affect the casual player's enjoyment of the progression system? Other players may want more simplified map and mechanical design to make the game easier, but how would that affect the hardcore players after logging 500 hours in the game? It's easy to say that I want it my way and screw everyone else who disagrees, but I don't think that's healthy for the game or the community that enjoys it. While more things can be done to benefit both sides of this equation, I think we should first ask ourselves how it would affect the other group, since ultimately, I feel this is an area of the game that requires a bit of compromise.
Nice moves.
But now I want to switch gears and talk about Titanfall's weaknesses as a franchise. While I think that Titanfall 2 is one of the best games I've ever played, there are still some issues that I think should be addressed. While I could bring up all sorts of little nitpicks here and there, I'm only going to bring up what I think are Titanfall 2's biggest problems. The first is Titanfall's small player base. Now I'm not going to go on about the launch date and circumstances surrounding Titanfall 2's sales, since these topics have already been talked about to death. Sure, some people will say that all Titanfall 3 needs to succeed is a better marketing campaign and release date, but I think there's more to it than that. If I were to ask players who don't play Titanfall about what they think of the game, I'll usually get one of two answers. The first is that Titanfall is just Call of Duty with mechs, and the second is that Titanfall is an overly chaotic high-mobility shooter. From the outside looking in, I can see why people think this about the franchise, but I take issue with both of these mentalities. When people compare Titanfall to Call of Duty, that to me is a pretty clear indicator that they don't understand the overarching mechanics of the game. Now, I'm not here to insult Call of Duty or those who play it. I actually think that Call of Duty and other highly casual multiplayer games have their place in modern gaming. Sometimes I just don't want to think very hard to have fun, and that's when a casual game like Call of Duty is nice to play. But at the same time, Titanfall is not one of these games. There's a lot of thought and strategy that goes into developing your skills as a player. You need to learn different routes, understand Titan matchups, match the mobility, learn ability strategies, predict spawns, listen for enemy players, and so many more. But most importantly, players need to learn the metagame around Titan combat. Understanding when to drop your Titan, what Titan you should use, and how to earn your Titan efficiently is the difference between a good pilot and a great one. These are the reasons why Titanfall is so much more complex than a game like Call of Duty. The 3D map traversal doesn't funnel players down predictable lanes, mobility makes flanking faster, abilities can change engagements in an instant, Titan presence commands attention, pilots need to support their friendly Titans, the enemy can counterpick your Titan, map control grants cover in line of sight, and so on. These are all elements that you simply don't see in a game like Call of Duty, and comparing Titanfall to it is misinformation at best, and a flat-out lie at worst. The only similarities are that you can aim down sights, sprint, and kill players fairly quick. It's a shame that so many people who have never played Titanfall just assume that it's similar to Call of Duty, when in reality, these two games are extremely different experiences. As for people who think that Titanfall is an overly chaotic, high-mobility shooter, this is a bit more understandable. I think that many people who feel this way have probably seen some high-level gameplay from players like GameSager and didn't really understand what was going on. The skill set in Titanfall is very different from most modern games, and when people who have never played the game see this type of extreme mobility gameplay, they assume that this is the requirement for skilled play. But this isn't actually the case. I'll admit that my movement and aim can occasionally be quite sloppy, but I often do well regardless. It might be somewhat controversial to say, but I honestly think the best sign of a good player isn't how fast they can move, but rather their awareness and game sense. One of Titanfall's biggest misconceptions that's often perpetuated by its own community is that players need to move fast in order to do well. But I don't think this is always true. In fact, one of my best strategies for dealing with high-skill players is to play a bit slower and reserved. Don't get me wrong, fast movement is still a very important aspect of skilled play, but it isn't always a requirement. This constant emphasis on fast movement can be extremely daunting for people who have never actually played the game, and when Titanfall players talk to them, they often say they need to move fast in order to do well. But in my opinion, the skills that new players should focus on are awareness and game sense before they try their hand at mobility. Ultimately, it doesn't matter how fast you're moving if you're heading towards your death. Without a good understanding of Titanfall's maps, spawns, and metagame, a match of multiplayer is just an indistinguishable blur that flashes in front of you before you die. So it doesn't surprise me that many new players, or people who haven't actually played the game, think that Titanfall is overly fast and chaotic, since without understanding the experience at a fundamental level, it's practically incomprehensible. Titanfall is a franchise which I think is often misrepresented by both its fans and detractors, and I don't think this is healthy for expanding the player base. From the outside looking in, it seems that people who have never played Titanfall think that it's either a shallow COD clone or an extremely complicated try-hard sweatfest. But in reality, I don't think that Titanfall is either of these things. Titanfall's other major weakness is related much closer to the actual gameplay, and I'm sure the people who have played Titanfall understand this issue from one side or the other. I'm of course talking about snowballing and pub stomping. I want to start off by saying that I don't think these problems will ever go away fully, since that would take away from what Titanfall is at its core. As a game that revolves around momentum, I think these issues are somewhat inherent to the experience. The sad reality is that I have a hard time recommending Titanfall 2's multiplayer to a new player in 2019. The fact of the matter is that all of Titanfall 2's current players had the benefit of learning how to play the game while everyone was still bad at it. Whereas nowadays, a new player is subject to some of the most brutal pub stomping I've ever seen in a video game. However, I do think that while these problems will never go away fully, their negative effects could be reduced. Throughout the course of this series, I'll refer to these issues quite often as I explain various ideas on how to address this problem. I honestly think one of the hardest questions that modern multiplayer game designers often face is how to introduce new players to an existing franchise without upsetting the current player base. Very few games have had an effective answer, and I don't envy the position that Respawn is in while trying to juggle new and old fans. For the last section of this video, I want to quickly go over what you guys can expect from this series. Despite this being the first episode, this was actually the last part of the script that I wrote and narrated. I did this because I wanted to evaluate what this series actually turned out to be before making any promises or statements. The first thing that you should know before watching the other videos is that this series is extremely in-depth. The shortest episode, excluding this one, is around 20 minutes long, and I probably could have talked about these topics for an hour each. But for the sake of time, I actually cut out a lot of content and ideas that I had. Titanfall is a surprisingly complex game, which leads me to my next point. This series requires a pretty decent understanding of Titanfall and its mechanics. If you don't play Titanfall or haven't played it too much, you may be a bit confused about what I'm talking about. If, however, you're a Titanfall veteran, I doubt that you'll have a hard time following along. I should also note that I play Titanfall on console, and all of my opinions are framed from a console player's perspective. If you're a PC player, please keep in mind that some of the issues that I bring up may not affect you, and for the most part I won't bring up problems in the PC community. These are issues that I simply don't have enough understanding to really talk about. Yet another thing that you should know about this series is that many of my ideas delve way too far into implementation. What I mean by this is that I'll suggest plenty of ideas where I have absolutely no idea whether or not they would work. The reason for this is because I want to give mechanical examples for overarching concepts. A good example of this would be my Titan redesign videos, where I go in depth about changes to weapons and abilities to merely give examples about concepts like limited Titan customization. I fully understand that many of my ideas may not work all that well, but there's a big difference between a flawed concept and flawed execution. Next, I want to mention that I say Titanfall 3 very often in this series. Keep in mind that I started writing the script for these videos over a year and a half ago, and at that time we had little to no information about the next Titanfall game. So whenever I say Titanfall 3, try to keep in mind that I'm referring to any future Titanfall game, and not necessarily Titanfall 3 in particular. And lastly, I also want to explain the part of this series that I'm not too proud of. I know that most people are pretty self-conscious about their voice, but I still feel the need to explain that commentary is not my strong suit. To put it plainly, my vocal cords are pretty easily irritated and my sinuses are often quite congested. It really just comes down to bad genetics, and while I tried my absolute best, there are a few issues that you may notice with my commentary. The first is that my voice can occasionally sound strained or muffled. Drinking water and tea helped out a little bit, but it's still quite noticeable in the longer episodes. The other issue I run into is that I talk very fast. With how my vocal cords work, it's often much easier for me to keep my voice going if I don't pause or stop. I've got to keep the train going, or else I risk some pretty serious voice cracks and coughing fits. In total, I probably did about 2 or 3 hours of audio editing on my commentary per episode. I did my best, and I can only hope that it's not too noticeable or intrusive. But for this reason, I'll leave a link to the script down in the description of each video. But anyways, the future of the Titanfall franchise is a topic that many people are both hopeful and concerned about. I've heard a lot of interesting ideas coming from the community, many of which I wholeheartedly agree with, and some that I wholeheartedly don't. But regardless of my opinions on the matter, I understand and respect where a lot of these ideas are coming from. I don't want to state my opinions in a belligerent or offensive way, and I hope that the viewers of this series will extend me the same courtesy. Normally I'd be worried about posting a video with some controversial ideas, but honestly, I have a lot of faith that players in the Titanfall community will welcome some different opinions and healthy discussion. If I get good enough comments and suggestions, I may make a follow-up video to this series where I discuss some of the best ideas from viewers. But that all depends on how many people watch and comment, so if you guys enjoyed this series, please share it with your friends. I also want to say that I am not a AAA game designer. I do a little bit of game design work with a small team of independent developers, but it isn't even comparable to AAA development. I don't want to come off as someone who thinks they know better than veteran game developers, since these are people who have made some of my favorite games of all time. Ultimately, I'm making this series because I love thinking about game design, not because I actually think I'll influence Respawn's design decisions. Everything I'm going to discuss in this series are just my opinions and should be taken with a grain of salt. What I do bring, though, is the perspective of a player who has put in over 750 hours of playtime in Titanfall 2 and has used every weapon in Titan extensively throughout every patch and update. Before I end this video, I want to give a quick shout out to my friends Spider-Man C612 and Xander who helped me with titles, image cutouts, art, and so much more. I couldn't have made this series without their support, and to both of you, I just want to say that I really appreciate your help. But on that note, it's time to end this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next episode where I'll discuss the pilot gameplay for Titanfall 3.